Why did the Sumerian people have such an outsized impact on world history? Although the Sumerians were unique and innovative people who had many creations and inventions that were impactful, their most important one was writing. The Sumerians' invention of writing allowed for the emergence of the first literary tradition, thus allowing history to emerge as a unique discipline. And so the 3 points here are their impact on early development of writing, their influence on the early history of literature, and the relationship between their literature and the events found in Hebrew literature. So first is their impact on early development of writing. So they were the first ones who kind of started writing. And the way it started out as was marking property. So they would use little seals that they would roll as kind of to show ownership, and then later they also used little wedge-shaped marks to keep track of grain that they would store in warehouses. And so this is kind of where writing came from. And so we can really look to them for kind of most of the origins of things like this, of our words and stuff, if you go back far enough. So, interestingly enough, one word, freedom, the concept of freedom is where, was first found with the Sumerians. And originally it meant a debt paid in full. So kind of the idea was you no longer owe anyone anything, you're free. And translated, it kind of meant return to mommy, come back, to be returned to the owner. So coming to Papa, if you're talking about money or something. So that was, Another thing we see in their early writing are some of the first jokes, which is interesting to see that the history of comedy goes back so far. So one of them, there was a man and his wife had just died, and at the funeral, a priest came up to him and asked who rests in peace. And he said, me, now that she's gone. Am I right, fellas? Another one, a guy was walking by and he saw a boy drowning. The boy gets out of the water and he says, I won't go back into the water until I learn how to swim. So you get the idea. The point is these are kind of the, this is kind of the first place we see this, because this is the first place we were really able to record things like this. So it really helps us get a better view into their history. So being the first people to invent writing was very significant. They even have stories about this in their mythology. A story called Enmerkar and the Lord of Orada says, quote, the Lord of Kolaba patted some clay and put words on it, like a tablet. Until then, there had been no putting words on clay, end quote. So that just shows how they also kind of knew that they were the ones who had started this, and it was part of their culture in a deep way. All right, on to point 2, the influence of the history of literature. So the Sumerians played a huge role in developing writing. In fact, the first author was from their culture. Her name was Iheduana or something like that. And she wrote some poems and stuff. She was the daughter of Sargon, the king, and she was the high priestess of the moon goddess Inanna. So she wrote a poem about the ceremony, the New Year's ceremony. So essentially it was a parade where the high goddess, her in this case, was cleaned and bathed, and Uruk, or the high priest representing Uruk, was in the procession. And the procession was towards her shrine, where the temple workers would sing love songs and they greeted each other, and Uruk would give gifts to her, and then they seated themselves on their thrones. After that, they entered a chamber with fragrances, And at the very end of the ceremony, she blessed him. So that was written in poetry. That was one of the first poems we have. However, it's not really poetry in the sense that we think of it now. It wasn't rooted in rhyme, more meaning. Specifically, they use parallel lines. So this is something we see in ancient Hebrew poetry as well. So kind of the idea is you speak in like pairs of lines that are parallel to each other. So there are a few different types. So there's one where you say something and then you say something kind of synonymous with it. So like you kind of reiterate it. There's another one where you say it and then you kind of like say the contrasting idea. You kind of like contrast it a bit. And then there's a last one where you compare it to something. So you like give an idea and then you give a comparison. And so these are kind of the three main ways they talked in pairs of lines. This is very similar. They did this in Hebrew poetry as well. According to Andrew Rappaport, quote, "The key to understanding Hebrew poetry is looking for the parallelism," end quote. So this kind of shows the extent of their influence on ancient writing. Point 3, their connection to biblical scripture. Many events in the Bible are also seen in Sumerian texts, and many also take place in Sumer or Mesopotamia. For example, Abraham, the father of Israel, came from Ur. So this suggests that Jews have a lineage that traces back to Mesopotamia, which means that the Jews and the Sumerians would have been related now. There are also some interesting stories that are in kind of like Sumerian mythology that are also in the Bible. So, for example, in the story of Gilgamesh, there is kind of a story that's very similar to the creation. So a man named Ikindu is created, and he is naked, which is also like the Bible, and he kind of lives with the animals. He ends up having kind of like a fall due to women, and the animals leave, in the same way where Adam is given the fruit by Eve, and then they're kicked out of the garden. There's also a flood story in this, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where there's a man who has some sort of divine warning, and then there's a flood coming, and he builds a large ark. He's told how to build this ark by a god. Then he takes a bunch of animals in the boat, and then after being in there for a while, releases the birds, lands on a mountain, and afterwards gives a sacrifice to the main god, who then blesses him. So this is very, very similar to Noah's story. One other interesting story, this is very fascinating, is where they kind of overlap in the story of Jericho. So there was an interesting group of people called the priestesses of Ninkasi, or alewives, who would live in kind of like the temple, and they would make beer and sell it in the temple as well as foods. So this was kind of their job, and this was kind of a safe space where people could just come and drink beer and no police or anything would bother them. And so these people, this was maybe a common lifestyle for these women. They were usually polyamorous. And so it is thought that perhaps when the spies came to visit Jericho, Rahab, it says she took them to their house and fed them. So perhaps it was actually one of these temple places. So this is like where they were going to stay safe. And it also mentions kind of her like friends who seem to have a lot of connection to this kind of lifestyle of being an alewife. So that's kind of interesting, just how those two overlap. One last story that's interesting is Gilgamesh has a plant in the end of the story that will make him live forever. He thinks, at least. But then he's a little careless with it, and according to Morris Jastrow Jr., quote, "A serpent comes along and snatches the plant from him," end quote. So this is very similar to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. You have the two serpents, one who tricks Adam and Eve, one who steals the plant directly, and then the one who tricks Adam and Eve eventually that causes them to get kicked out of the garden and away from the tree of life. So you can really see kind of the parallels between these two texts and how they must have influenced each other. So, although the Sumerians were unique and innovative people who had many impactful inventions and creations, their most important one was definitely writing. The Sumerian invention of writing allowed for the emergence of the first literary tradition, thus allowing history to emerge as a unique discipline. So first, they had a large impact on early development of writing. Then they had a large influence on the history of literature. And finally, the relationship to the events found in Scripture. Thank you.